As many of you may have noticed, Sacktown Talks is under new management, and myself, Jarrett Blanian, will begin to continue to host the show in the future. We wish Gibran Massel the best and thank him for developing the platform to create a space for the Capitol community to have conversations and dive deep into policy matters. Gibran's going to continue podcasting on his own on a variety of topics, mostly covering martial arts, social commentary, and the occasional political conversation. All of his social properties can be found on his website, gibransplace.com. Give him a follow and check out his website. Thanks. Hello and welcome to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Today we have a very special guest, Senator Holly Mitchell, fresh off a budget negotiation, joining us today. Holly, welcome to the program and thanks for coming on. How you doing? I'm
great. Thanks for having me.
Yesterday, you guys just sent Governor Newsom a budget proposal. Can you kind of let us know, I guess, kind of how that went yesterday and kind of how you think the governor is going to take your proposal in these next few days?
Well, we're in the middle of negotiations, and of course, I hope that he takes the proposal well. It was a two-party negotiated deal between the Senate and the Assembly. We had full debate on the floor yesterday. From our perspective, it is a more strategic approach than what we received in the May revise. Fewer harmful cuts to California residents who are really currently still struggling in the middle of a public health and economic pandemic. And so we were able to stabilize funding through K through 14 education, higher ed, didn't levy deep cuts into many of the health and social service programs that California residents rely on. So I feel good about the document that we were able to pass off the Senate floor yesterday.
The last few years, California has saved a bunch of money in a rainy day fund, kind of waiting for this rainy day to come. Kind of, I guess in the future years, how much of our reserves are we spending this year? And, are we going to have enough to help us next year and the year after when we could still be coming out of this kind of doldrums of economic recession?
Well, the point of a reserve is to spend it when you need it. And clearly with the $54 billion deficit, we need it. And we were saving, particularly in the safety net reserve account. The point of having a safety net reserve account was to not cut deeply in the safety net programs when California residents would need it most. And when we consider the unemployment rate, the uptick in CalWorks applications, we're clear that California residents need the support now. And so we put forward a plan that would spend down a portion of it, but not all of it. We have multiple rainy day funds. And every year when we pass a budget, it's not just for the single budget year. It's budget year plus one or two. As was the deficit. The $54 billion deficit was not just for this fiscal year. It was this fiscal year plus one. So we will. Our plan was to spend down a portion of them, a portion that we thought was appropriate to do. But we won't have to do that if we indeed get the support from the federal government. The governor's May revise, as well as the budget we passed yesterday, is really balanced on the assumption that the federal government will come in with additional federal dollars. And both budgets have a trigger element. What was different, what we passed yesterday from what the governor proposed was we fund all of those services on the front end, drawing down reserves, and pull the trigger only if those dollars don't come in by October 1st. Okay, the governor, in essence, in his May revise, made the trigger cuts effective July 1. And we knew that Congress wouldn't have time to seriously take into consideration additional resources, really not just to California, but to all the states in the union. And so the triggers are being used, not the triggers, the reserve accounts, the various rainy day funds and the reserve accounts are being used for exactly what we set them aside for.
This is I guess we're in interesting times here. The shelter in place orders, you've been budget chair for, a few years now. I guess kind of how was negotiating this budget with the deficit, the shelter in place, the remote legislating, how did you, I guess, how was it different than previous years? And I guess how much of a challenge was the shelter in place and the remote, legislating to you in putting this budget together?
Well, we all were experiencing nothing like we've ever experienced before. There was my colleague, the vice chair, Senator Nielsen, yesterday complained about process. And I thought about it. And in my closing, I stood up and I said, this is my 10th year in the legislature, my 10th budget. And as I recall, every year there's some complaint about process. When we have a conference committee, there's a complaint about the agendas and how the conference committee is structured. When we don't have a conference committee this year, there's a complaint about that.
Right.
And so process is often called into question, quite frankly, by the minority party. Putting that aside, what we have a responsibility to debate is content. I reminded everybody that thanks to Prop 25, we have to have everything in print 72 hours before we can cast a vote on it. And so without question, it's been a challenge. These are challenging times in which we're all living. The reality is his May revise was in effect a brand new budget. And so we had to do in 1 month, what we typically take 6 months to do. When a governor introduces a budget in January, and we have until June 15th to take it up on the floor of our respective houses. And so it was a challenge, but we stepped up. Yesterday, I thanked, the public servants, the staff who worked tirelessly to delve deeply into his proposal, the LAO, Department of Finance, the staff on both sides of the aisle, to really pull together, the documents that we as duly elected members of the legislature have the responsibility to act upon. And so was it an ideal set of circumstances? No. No one has experienced an ideal set of circumstances in the middle of this public health pandemic. And so I feel really good, very confident in the document that we were able to debate, formulate, and vote on yesterday on behalf of every resident of the state of California.
You alluded to, in previous years, you would have a conference committee where I guess the Assembly and the Senate would kind of hash out their differences on the budget. Effectively without a conference committee this year, how are you and the Assembly able to, I guess, balance your budgets so they align?
We were both houses, Mr. Ting, the Assembly Budget Chair, and I were clear about this time frame issue. And the two houses had a bit of a different schedule and a different process. They had a committee of the whole to pose questions to finance. We followed the more traditional route. I had a full Senate Budget Committee where we asked questions about the May revise. The day or two after it was released, we then went into full budget subcommittees, and then again had all that work roll up into a document that the full Senate committee reviewed and voted on. The Assembly took a different path this year. And so all along in that process, much like what happens in a conference committee, at the staff level and leadership level, we were having conversations about our framework for the budget. I think the Senate came out early on and talked about the architecture around the budget that we were going to put in place. The Assembly reviewed it and supported it. And we were just going through that process, able to communicate and make sure that we were kind of in lockstep. And so I think the budget that ultimately came to the floor in both houses, the one that went in print on Friday, was a accurate reflection of the two houses working together seamlessly to bring a budget to bear. And both houses were very clear. All of our bright ideas in January and February about what the health of the general fund and the kind of investments we'd be able to make in our districts, we could no longer do. We are in crisis mode. The virus catapulted the state into a deep recession. The LAO did a yeoman's job in their spring finance letter of laying out options and ways in which we should be viewing our recovery, be it an L shape or a U shape. And we took all that information and we took action. Now it's the two houses, based on what we passed yesterday, in negotiations with the administration to make sure that we ultimately pass and he signs a balanced budget that's in the best interest of all California.
Interesting. You kind of touched upon a recovery, whether it's an L shape, a U shape, a V shape. When are we going to start seeing signs of, I guess, kind of what the recovery is going to start looking like, and I guess enable you to make preparations for future budgets?
That's a really good question, and I don't know that I have the answer. I think that we see incremental signs of recovery, but again, we've not kind of gone back to quote, business as usual. It's the degree to which the state is reopening is varying county by county. And so it's going to take a minute for us to be able to fully experience sales taxes, back kind of in full swing. And with an unemployment rate in the double digits, some communities suffering more than others, it will be a while before we can look across the state and really measure the health of this recovery. We know it will be multiple years, and we've got to plan accordingly.
Back in early March, was it mid-March, March 12th, we all got the sheltering in place order. Kind of what did sheltering in place look like for you? And kind of how were you able to work and I guess manage your responsibilities from home?
I am so proud to be a sitting member of the Senate under the leadership of President Pro Tem Tony Atkins and the Secretary of the Senate, Erica Contreras. They were on it. They understood fundamentally that they had the responsibility to protect the health and safety of the legislature, the general public, and our staff. We are an employer. And so immediately plans went into place to make sure that people had the resources they need to both shelter at home and continue their work. I understood that my constituents would need us more than ever. And so it was very important to me, like little things, like a live person would answer my phones in both offices. Not a matter of leave a message, we'll get back to you. That wasn't going to happen for the residents of the 30th Senate District. And so we put together a system in which, the phones would roll over immediately to a live person who could then direct you to the appropriate staffer. And the Senate gave us resources. Those who didn't have laptops were given laptops. And I'm proud to say my staff has continued to grind. I see it in the emails and the acknowledgments that come to my website for the constituents who've been assisted with their EDD claims, for constituents who are still getting services through the regular constituent services kind of process. And, I had a staff meeting with all staff early on in the process because, this was something we were all struggling with. People just didn't know how long it was going to last, what it was going to mean, how are we going to be able to get our work done. And I told them, like Kendrick Lamar says, we're going to be all right. And I'm glad to say that we have been, and we have come up with, creative ways in which we engage as a team with I call them all-star meetings because they're stars. With our all-staff meeting once a week. My chief of staff is connecting more frequently with those in the district office. We check in weekly to make sure the district office staff is able to elevate the issues they're hearing from constituents. Case in point with the Employment Development Department. Early on in the stay-at-home mandate, the caucus was having our regular weekly caucus calls, and the pro tem was bringing in, and the administration was giving us the opportunity to ask questions and hear directly from many department heads. And so Secretary Julie Sue was giving us updates on the Employment Development Department every week. And I was able to share with her the perspective of my constituents because of the system we had in place. And so it wasn't ideal, but I think we transitioned. Again, proud of the Senate that they set up early on a process by which I was able to convene a Senate budget informational hearing as chair of the JLBC. It wasn't an official JLBC hearing, but we were able to convene a Senate subcommittee hearing, through using Zoom and various other mediums. I was actually in the hearing room. Senator Nielsen was also, but all the other members of the subcommittee participated electronically, as well did Department of Finance and LAO. Took public comment through the phone. And so we were the first house to really be able to test out that system, and it worked.
I remember seeing that committee hearing, and it was kind of, very eye-opening to see, I guess, this new normal we're all going to be living with you there with the masks on, no press coming in. I guess, how has it been coming back to the Capitol, going back and forth through your district with all these new protocols and enhancements, and kind of how are you, able to do your job, with, I guess, not being, able to be close to people or, talk with them regularly, how are you able to talk with your colleagues and so forth?
Well, my poor cell phone is probably going to just collapse after this. And I actually had to invest and buy a new desktop for myself because the iPad and the cell phone trying to do all these Zoom meetings were not working for me. So I had to up my own technology game. But we're doing what we can. It's not a lot of fun. A part of serving as an elected official is really the camaraderie and the experience of connections with your colleagues, and we don't have that. To be on the floor so spread out, you can't have a sidebar with your seatmate. Some of them behind kind of the plexiglass. We're not able to walk around on the floor to talk about our bill. So it requires, a different kind of advocacy where we're calling people ahead of time. And so it's not fun. I mean, I've said that on the floor the other day where I looked around and I said, this just isn't a lot of fun. I don't question whether or not we aren't as effective. Just on a very human level, it's just not as fun as it used to be. And I hope that we can return to a time when we're not separated as a result of social distancing and behind plexiglass.
Earlier in the session, people had big plans. A lot of people were carrying big bill packages. Kind of, I guess, how has your bill package changed in light of, COVID-19 and having to pare down your bill package, and kind of now that the budget's over, what's your bill package going to look like going forward?
And so I've got two-year bills that I'm still managing through the process, Senate Bill 144 and Senate Bill 555. I'm also very proud to be an active member of the California Legislative Black Caucus. And quite frankly, in direct response to what we're experiencing in terms of the issues of white supremacist ideology impacting, from my perspective, law enforcement, and the multiple deaths that we are seeing almost on a daily basis across our TV screen, we've got a pretty aggressive package to talk not only about police transparency and accountability. That's work that I and members of the Black Caucus have been doing for years, but also really beginning to peel back the layers of what are the structural issues that continue to oppress one segment of our community, African Americans. And so we've got a bill package of, I think it's up to about 10 bills that I'm going to proudly co-author and really do all that I can collectively with the members of my caucus to carry them across the finish line. One such bill will be up in Labor Committee on Wednesday, and it's ACA 5. It's our effort to get an issue back on the ballot for voters to grapple with in November that deals with affirmative action. We recognize that 209, 24 years ago now, had significant, perhaps unintended consequences when we look at the support or lack of support or the dwindling numbers of women venture capitalists or women business owners or women who are able to get contracts through government, not to mention the impact it's had on the diversity of UC and CSU, all public university campuses, since the day it passed. And so I'm pleased to be a member of a caucus that we're looking from a very broad-based perspective about issues of equity and the structural institutions, if you will, that continue to penalize one group of people over another.
I guess it's a really interesting time. It's kind of like 1918 mixed with 1968. And, we have this great policy window open. Everyone's at home. Everyone's kind of paying attention to things now. You've mentioned stuff you've done in the past to kind of address these issues. And there's a lot of talk about, I guess, changing the way policing is done, here nationally. Kind of, in your opinion, how could policing change in the future to kind of better resolve some of these equity things you're bringing up?
Well, I think there are any number of ways policing could change. Everything from what we do on the front end in terms of the psychosocial tests that law enforcement are given. We spend a lot of time on the back end talking about training and trying to retrain and reorient people to a more humane kind of treatment of the people that they are taking oath to protect and serve. And so Assemblywoman Autumn Burke has raised the issue within the caucus, like, we need to look at the job descriptions. What are we hiring people to do? Others of my colleagues have acknowledged the fact that, LAPD former police chiefs of many moons ago have talked very openly about going to the South to recruit people to come to Los Angeles and be members of the LAPD. And so we've got to create a real culture shift within law enforcement. And that, requires stopping bad apples from even entering the force, stopping bad apples from moving from one department and one jurisdiction to another, making sure that the culture speaks to our societal expectations about fairness and equity, that we have open conversations about bias, implicit and explicit. That we have measurable policy and language around our expectations around use of excessive force. And if you do, what the general public can expect will come of that action in terms of arrests, in terms of investigations. To see what I interpret as this amazing knee-jerk reaction from a law enforcement entity in Palmdale to issue a press statement that the young man that was found hanging from a tree in Palmdale in the middle of a public square, that they assumed it was suicide before the investigation was complete, is completely unacceptable, with no evidence of a ladder. And then to have changed their public statement to it was depression as a result of COVID-19 before the investigation is complete suggests that they need help. And I'm glad to know that our state's attorney general is going to help them through this investigation. But those are examples of just egregious acts that we, as a civilized society, just can't allow to continue.
Right. You were maybe 3 or 4 years old in 1968 during the first civil rights movement. Me at around 5 or 6. I remember 1992, Rodney King. In 2014. We had a rash of similar cases, similar issues, and we didn't see this same response. Here in 2020, kind of, I guess, as the world stopped, it took everyone not having something to do to finally stop and realize that this is a problem. Kind of, I guess, why do you think now this moment has arisen where it didn't happen in 2014 or 1992 or prior, where you have this, I guess, window of this deep demand for change?
I'm not sure. And I look forward to reading the studies of political scientists and social scientists in the years to come that will help differentiate what we are experiencing now in 2020 from kind of the previous. I had the pleasure of being on a panel in 2015, hosted by Zocalo, UCLA, and I think LACMA in Los Angeles. And it was about kind of the difference between protests and riots. And there was a brilliant UCLA historian that kind of walked us through kind of protest movements. There was another gentleman there who studied riots. And what my takeaway from that was this notion that, people with agency, people who are empowered, can protest properly. And riots evoke when people have had the figurative, and in this instance, literal foot or knee up against your throat. And it is a visceral reaction to oppression, quite frankly. And I think it will be interesting to really plot the progression of this experience, to have an organized effort called Black Lives Matter, who've been organizing since 2013, to educate people about the series of inequities. Some people are saying, "Oh, it's because of the cameras. We can see it live." Well, I visited the lynching museum in Alabama when it first opened a year or two ago, and lynchings were like public events where people would take pictures, and postcards were made of Black people hanging from trees, and so. Throughout our time, people have borne witness to these heinous acts. Back then, they were celebrated. They took pictures with the hanging body behind them to show I was here. I, in essence, participated. So we've come a long way from that attitude. But, I don't know that I have the answer to what will be different this time. People are recognizing the number of young people. Most movements start with young people. The civil rights movement in the 50s. Dr. King wasn't even 40 by the time he was assassinated, so he was a very young man. Our sitting congressman who organized the march across the Pettus Bridge was a very young man in his 20s at the time. And so that's not new that young people have led movements. What's interesting about this movement is the preponderance of non-Black people who are participating. And that's great because, that validates my life experience as a Black woman. Other people saw that vicious murder with their own eyes and acknowledged that enough's enough. That was excessive force for what they assumed he had been engaging in, passing a counterfeit $20 bill. And then it's like this accumulative effect when people then began to look one after another, after another, after another of people whose lives were taken. Decisions were made about the supposed alleged crime they committed, and they were in essence executed in the public. People are fed up and are clear that racism is a pre-existing condition, and Black people who earn pennies to the dollar compared to our white counterparts, Black people who have health disparities that are off the chart compared to our real numbers in the population. All of that comes from someplace. And we have got to begin to unpack that history and create a society that treats people based on the content of their character and not the color of their skin.
What's amazing to me is you and your colleagues have done so much in the past 5-10 years on these issues. And what's eye-opening to me is, I guess, how systemic the problems are, and I guess how much more work is to be done. Can you kind of talk about, I guess, ACA 5 and how you think specifically that's going to help, I guess, alleviate some of these systemic issues in the future?
Well, I think, again, I want to, the package of bills that the Black Caucus is carrying. We've got bills dealing with, ethnic studies, so much. I was pleasantly surprised to visit a bookstore in my district with the governor, Essoan. And I was approaching them like, I know it's been tough with the closure and COVID, like, how are you all doing? I want you to survive. And I was pleasantly surprised to hear that they had been overwhelmed by online orders, that people are hungry for accurate depictions of our shared history. And so, you see on social media, all the books that are selling out, dealing with white fragility and all these things. And so, making ethnic studies an integral part of a core curriculum at the high school and collegiate level is an important opportunity to make sure that people understand true history. Voting rights, ACA 6, making sure that those who are formerly incarcerated regain their fundamental right to vote. Reparations is another bill in the package that really talks about what generations of systemic racism has done to a community in terms of multi-generational wealth, one's inability to provide, to own property and to support your children to be able to, end multi-generational poverty. And to have a task force here in California to talk about what reparations for Black people actually looks like. It's not an issue that we've avoided for other ethnic groups who have been wronged by this country. And so it's time that we talk about reparations for a community that has been structurally held back as a result of bias. And so I think the collection of all of those legislative efforts, we will begin to see real structural change.
I guess, speaking of reparations, that's something that's been talked about, I guess, for a long time. Kind of in your mind, do you have an idea of what a reparation package would look like?
Well, the original promise was 40 acres and a mule, which no one got. And we went from that period, that promise, to Jim Crow to take whatever else we had from us away. And I don't know, I think it'd be very interesting to hear a task force deliberate, to talk about how do you account for generations of accumulated wealth on the backs of those who helped build this country. How do you do that? When you think about the tobacco barons, and when you think about, how the Chinese were brought here to build the railroad, and then how the railroad barons, basically built California. Right. How do you then go backwards and figure out what a group of people are due? I loved it when my forever First Lady, Michelle Obama, talked about how important it was for her children to understand that Black men built the White House that they were living in. That's really a part of our history. How do we now go back and give people what they're due for those years of first free labor, then indentured servitude, and then generations of compacted ability to build wealth and earn a decent living? I don't know. I think the task force, it would be fascinating to hear their deliberations. I've heard, I think it's Dr. Weber who talked about this concept that, where we could start with is education. And perhaps every, Black Californian would have access to a free college education. So at least they could not be saddled with the debt of higher education as a way of kind of leveling the playing field, that notion of how do you level the playing field. So I think the conversation around ACA 5, reparations, is all an important dialogue to have. Through this period and through social media and the regular media, you hear people, white people, fundamentally understanding what privilege means. And there was a time when people would be defensive about that. Well, I didn't own slaves. I didn't benefit financially from that. But people are beginning to understand the privilege their skin color alone carries. When one person can walk down the street but not be harassed by law enforcement, and another person can't. When a Ivy League educated Black man could be bird watching, and a white woman actually be breaking the law by not having her dog on a leash, could be so offended by his mere presence that she called the police and shared the fact that she felt threatened by a Black man. I mean, those are just classic examples. The more recent example right here in the Bay Area, where the man was painting Black Lives Matter on the stoop of his own property.
Oh, yeah, I
and
saw
people
that.
Walking down the street asking him if he lived there and what was he doing and was he walking where? And he said, I live here. And then they challenged that because they, I guess, knew his wife and didn't assume that she'd be married to a man that looked like him. So, we all have a responsibility to check ourselves. I have taken the implicit bias tests. Many of my colleagues on the Senate Democratic caucus did as well several years ago. I brought that idea to the pro tem, and it wasn't to have any kind of public conversation about it or to be lectured about it. It's just a temperature check for yourself. How do I view the world? And where does that come from? And is it fair and accurate?
That's interesting. But, I guess for our listeners at home, if they wanted to take an implicit bias test, is there one you could recommend?
Oh, there are tools online. You just type in implicit bias test. Harvard has a series of tools based on gender, race, sexual orientation, all kinds of kind of indicators and factors. So I think it's Harvard. But if you Google it, there are all kinds of tests that you can take online in the privacy of your own home. And that will then kind of give you a basis of how you view the world and how skewed it is, because all of us have a skewed vision. The point is not to declare I'm not a racist. The point is to declare we all have implicit bias, and I am working on myself. That's what I prefer to hear. When people say to me, and I've had colleagues in the legislature say, "Oh, Holly, when I look at you, I don't see color." Well, there's nothing more offensive than that, because I am a Black woman. And so when you look at me, to not see that denies who I am, the culture that I come from, and the relevance of my ancestors' commitment to this country. So to not see color is in and of itself, from my perspective, a bias.
Interesting. Just, quickly, I wanted to touch on, I guess, a couple pieces of legislation you had. The first one is SB 555, Fair Access and Communications. Can you tell us a little bit about the bill and kind of how it's going and how you think it's going to help?
Happy to. Both bills are really dealing with the experience people have who are incarcerated. I had a group come to me a number of years ago who really educated me on, what it costs in terms of real dollars and cents to be locked up. At the state level, if you are an inmate in CDCR, you can have a job and earn money and have money on the books that you can then buy items from the commissary. At county jail, that's not the case. You don't work. And so it's up to your family to put money on your books. And so we're looking at more often than not, low-income families who are having to sacrifice to put money on the books to help their son and brother and husband or wife or girlfriend who are locked up. Then we went and looked at the phone systems, the computer systems, and the commissary. So the commissary is not like I can decide if I'm going to go to Costco or Target to get the best bargain.
Right.
You have one commissary. And then we realized that there was an inconsistent, ridiculous markup on items. And so to have family members come and tell us what a couple noodles cost in the commissary or deodorant or soap was astronomical. And so what we're asking is, don't, balance the whole county sheriff's department budget on the back of people who are trying to support their loved one in jail. That there shouldn't be just a unexplainable markup on items in the commissary, that we should limit those costs. They shouldn't be free. We appreciate that the county needs to help cover those costs, but you shouldn't be making an exorbitant profit on it. Historically, the profits from those items went into an inmate fund. And there are too many examples of where the accounting is questionable, where stakeholders assert that the county uses those dollars for expenses beyond the inmate fund. The inmate fund is supposed to bring programs and services that benefit the inmate, not cover administrative costs. That's what government budgets are for. So the focus of 555 is just to try to bring some control into the pricing of items in the commissary, as well as limit what one can charge for phone calls. You and I have cell phones now with packages where we have no idea. We pay a flat rate and can make as many calls as you possibly want to. They are still paying for calls by the minute. And they are at exorbitant rates. SB 144 really focuses on fines and fees, that once you have paid your debt to society, that research has shown that it really is almost like double jeopardy, that you are then paying exorbitant fines and fees once released. We've had testimony from people. I carried a bill with Ricardo Lara that eliminated fines and fees for juveniles. And we had testimony from people that just told painful stories about being released from juvenile hall and then their parents confronting a $5,000 or $6,000 bill, either for their ankle bracelet and the monitoring, or if you're in juvenile hall, your parents paid for literally your every night that you were there. And so these fines and fees for adults are equally as oppressive. People are released, trying to get their lives back, trying to get a job. And these fines and fees are levied, on you that limit your ability. People have lost driver's licenses and all kinds of things because they couldn't keep up with these government-sponsored fines and fees. All kind of research that suggests that, there are some counties that are continuing to collect fines and fees from people that they shouldn't because, in some areas we've had programs where if you don't have the ability to pay, then you shouldn't have to. Counties are still collecting them. So there's a whole body of research and a whole trend nationwide to eliminate these fines and fees because they are an additional burden on people who've already paid their debt to society for having served their time.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Mitchell, for joining us, and we look forward to talking to you again in the near future. Hello and welcome to another episode of Sacktown Talks. Today we have a special guest, Robert Rivas from the 30th Assembly District, joining us today. Robert, how's it going? Welcome to the show.
I appreciate the invitation to join you, and all is well in these turbulent and very challenging times. Certainly, very different times here at our state capitol, and but it's a pleasure to be here for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Shelter in place happened about March. We all went home. Can you describe, I guess, how sheltering in place was for you, and kind of how you were able to work with your constituency? Basically not being able to physically see people.
Right. Well, it was extremely challenging, to say the least. So I represent a beautiful district, a very large district geographically. I'm proud to say that I can, I'm proud that I can say that I grew up in the district I represent. So I grew up in San Diego County, it's a district that includes parts of 4 counties. And so it is extremely large. There's about a dozen cities within the district. And so, when I'm here in Sacramento, it's great. I get a park in the basement. I could walk to most of my meetings or have my meetings in my office here at the state capitol. But when I'm at home, I log a tremendous amount of miles because I'm driving from one county to the other, from one city to the other. And so not having the opportunity, in the shelter, when we sheltered in place, not having the opportunity to be out in the community, to visit, various stakeholders, leaders throughout the district and, all these different cities, counties, and our communities was very difficult, because I represent a district where, the issues are different for these different, counties and these different cities. And so certainly having to operate everything through our technology, through, Zoom, through conference calls, was incredibly challenging, and certainly took up a lot more time than people probably realize. And so it was an incredibly stressful time trying to address a lot of the concerns, trying to answer questions, trying to get information from the administration here in Sacramento, working constantly with my colleagues in the legislature, with the leadership, within the assembly. Being on, we had 2 standing conference calls that would last 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours. And so it was a very challenging time, and being at home, very lucky that my wife has always, the last few years has worked from home. Spending more time with my family was, different, but certainly was a good thing because I'm always on the road but certainly my mother, who takes care of my grandmother, who's close to 90, who lives less than a mile from where we live in Hollister. I didn't see them for nearly 2 months because we certainly didn't want to put them at risk, and certainly my grandmother at risk, being in the at-risk population to should she have contracted COVID. It was a very challenging time, very difficult, but still utilizing our technology, doing virtual calls regularly with our different cities, our different stakeholders. And so it looks like this is going to be the new normal for quite some time. And but it's something that we've adjusted to. Just this afternoon or at lunchtime, I joined a couple of my colleagues, Dr. Joaquin Arambula and Senator Ana Caballero. We had a virtual town hall around the challenges and the changes coming to EDD, as we have a record number of unemployment filings. And so this is the new normal, but we'll get through this and look forward to those days when there are our halls here in the Capitol are crammed, and we have the opportunity to get back home and jump on the road and go from city to all these different the communities, because my job is to be out and to listen and to work with all stakeholders within the district I represent, which is something I enjoy doing.
Yeah, recently we had a member, Cecilia Aguiar-Curry, on, and she kind of talked about in the rural areas of her county, there's not broadband access, and kind of seeing how your county is probably even more rural than hers, kind of using this new technology, digital medium, is it as effective where you are, and, is access has been a problem, I guess, for your constituents in reaching out to you during this period.
And so I appreciate Cecilia and her leadership. She's a great colleague. She's a great friend, but her leadership that she's brought around the conversation of broadband access, especially in rural areas. We actually carried a bill around expanding access to broadband in rural areas by focusing it on at our most remote fairgrounds in the state. But if anything, in my first term in the legislature, what I've learned to understand is certainly this is a state that's very difficult to govern because we're so large, we're so different, and there's no shortage of a crisis in California. And so how these crises, whether it's a housing crisis or utility crisis, now a public health crisis, it impacts every region of the state very differently. And so if it's anything that this public health crisis we're under now, it has really exacerbated some of these greater challenges. I certainly, coming from a region where I have lived my entire life, I've seen a lot of change. It's considered a suburban rural area. But this public health crisis certainly has exacerbated this issue of distance learning because of the connectivity lack thereof, of access for our rural parts, and that has that is developing an equity issue amongst education and how students aren't on a level playing field when it comes to getting the information and utilizing the technology to get that information. To establish a level playing field. And so how that's going to impact, educational outcomes for this year and beyond is a huge concern. But certainly, if it's, anything, every day I walk into this building, certainly it's always felt a bit like it's a very surreal experience, and ever anticipated to have the opportunity to represent my home in the state legislature. But I'm always reminded of where I came from. And so being that voice for a state, a part of the state that lacks essential services, that certainly, needs to be part of the conversation, the larger conversation on how we address housing in this state, how we address broadband access here in the state. If anything, if there's a silver lining to our current public housing crisis, it's the fact that we still have a long way to go to ensure that all people in California have the essential services, have the infrastructure, and have the resources that are offered in other parts of our state. We certainly have to do a better job here in California to ensure that our constituencies in all districts have these resources.
One thing that, was clear to a lot of us when the shelter in place first started, we all rushed to the grocery store, and, the shortages in food, and kind of in your district is where a lot of the food of the world is grown. Can you
That's
kind of,
right.
I guess, talk about how, the farming was impacted by the COVID crisis, and, are things beginning to normalize there? Are is food still being wasted?
Right.
And, I guess, what's being done for farm workers?
Right. And right. And so I appreciate the question, and it's a complex one. And it's a complex one because certainly, coming from a region where, the lifeblood of our economy is an agricultural one, where we're very dependent on a productive and viable agricultural industry, and I myself, I've talked often in my first year in the legislature about where I came from, and as I just mentioned, it's been a very surreal experience. If you would have asked me as a child that someday I'd serve in the legislature, I wouldn't have thought it possible, because I grew up in overcrowded housing. I grew up in attractive migrant farm worker housing. I was raised by a family of farm working immigrants. I was raised by my mom, who's a single parent, by my grandparents. And on top of that, I had a terrible speech impediment. It's a disability I've had my entire life. And so having to overcome that. And so being a public servant was never, ever part of my plan. But, certainly in this region that is so dependent on agriculture, that is, I've known at an early age, as long as I can remember, my grandfather stepping out of, our farm worker housing unit every single morning, and he would walk out into the fields where he would work every day. He was a field worker for over 50 years. And so his work to my family was essential, because here in my office, I have his paycheck hanging on my wall. In the late 80s, that paycheck shows that he was earning $6.33 an hour. And on that wage, he supported our entire family. So his work was essential to our family, but also understanding that he was part of that incredibly important food network that provided food security to not only our family, but to our state and to our country. And so farm workers and the agricultural industry has always been an incredibly important part of the history of the state, of our economy, and of ensuring that we all have fresh produce on our tables. And so certainly how this pandemic has impacted our district has been a concern. It continues to be a concern. There has been a spike in the rate of infections in Monterey County, and they are overwhelmingly in the district I represent, in the city of Salinas, in the Salinas Valley. An overwhelming percentage of all infections in the county of Monterey are coming, from Latino parts of the county, from farm working areas, because of this is an incredibly vulnerable population, where you look at every aspect of their job, traveling to and from work in overcrowded, in these crowded buses. They work in close proximity to one another. They share tools. They maintain the same equipment. It's very difficult for them to social distance on the job. But I commend the County of Monterey. They proactively got together industry, local elected officials, supervisors, Chris Lopez, former Assemblymember, Supervisor Luis Alejo. I commend them for working with them to establish kind of a first set of workplace guidelines and these guidance documents to ensure workers were protected and aware of the challenges that this virus poses, and trying to prevent an outbreak. But at the same time, you have a very vulnerable group of employees and a population of people that go home and they can't social distance. They can't shelter in place because they live in critically overcrowded conditions. And we have all the local data to prove it, as the fight that we had advocating for our priority bill last year, our farm worker housing bill. And it is incredibly unacceptable in a state that is touted as having the 5th largest economy in the world, being the most innovative state. But you have people, especially in the district I live, that live in third world country conditions. It is a humanitarian crisis. You have it is stifling opportunity for future generations. I talk about my experience living in overcrowded conditions, but families, I had it easy when you compare to the living conditions of families and children right now here in 2020. And that needs to change. And as a state, we need to do a better job to ensure that our farm working families and that all people in this state and all parts of the state, rural, urban, that they have access to, dignified housing. Because, I attribute all of the opportunities I've had to that, housing security that myself, my brother, and my family had. And certainly it wasn't, the best, unit, but it gave my family every opportunity to pursue opportunities to go to college and one day serve in the legislature, certainly, how this virus is impacting that is certainly exacerbating the rate of infection that continues to rise, especially amongst our, essential farm working, workers and how it's going to impact their families.
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is when you're a farm worker, you are essential. If you don't show up for work, A, you're not going to get paid for that day, and B, there's no next man up, right?
That's right.
Work up. So I guess what's being done, to protect these workers in case they do get sick and they have to take 2 weeks off because their job is extremely physically strenuous. And, if you get COVID, it seems like, you're going to be out for 2-3 weeks just recuperating. Mm-hmm. So I guess what's being done, to kind of fill the gap in for these workers?
Sure. And that's a great question. And, the issue is obviously the agricultural industry. They continue to face labor challenges and a shortage of labor. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. Obviously, when you have a president such as President Trump and his administration, all of the anti-immigrant rhetoric, It's certainly, you have a very vulnerable population that is living in the shadows. So you have agricultural workers, or you have an agricultural industry that is very dependent on foreign labor. When in the district I represent, there's an estimated over 100,000 farm workers and their families that are able to work, but because of their legal status are unable to work. And so that's something that we've got to look. We've certainly need Congress. We need both the Democrats and Republicans to do a better job and do something about our immigration problems, because all that is tied to our food security. All of that is tied to these labor challenges we face in agriculture, and it directly impacts our local economy, our state economy, and our national economy. But more to your question, I commend the County of Monterey in doing everything they can to provide guidance and to provide this very proactive document to ensure that all agricultural employers within the county were protecting employees and how they were doing their job. And so we introduced the bill essentially based on the work that was done in Monterey County, because there is what we have now in California is we have a patchwork. If we're going to prevent an outbreak, if we're going to prevent what's occurred in other states like South Dakota, where an outbreak, a COVID-19 outbreak, essentially shut down a meat processing plant, we have to avoid that here, and we have to avoid it at all costs, because it impacts all of us. As I mentioned, it's a food security issue. And so certainly what we're trying to do is try to create an educational, component where we're educating workers in English and in Spanish, because there is a language barrier, issue where, a lot of our farm workers speaking in Spanish or only Spanish, but educating them on, workplace protections when it comes to safety, PPE, but then also working with Cal OSHA, working with the administration, working with the industry to create a standard, a set of standards that will apply to, the entire state, to all workers, and to the entire industry, because we shouldn't have a patchwork county by county where some counties and some industry members are doing a very proactive, very good job, and in others it's non-existent. And so certainly, working with them, and eventually our bill just got out of the Assembly, certainly needs more work, but I look forward to working with the industry to ensure that we have a workable bill, because at the end of the day, it's about ensuring that our agricultural industry remains viable, productive, and that workers remain healthy, that they're able to report to the job and continue reporting to the job, because of the labor challenges that we face. And as you mentioned, finding a replacement for an ill worker is incredibly challenging, and so then obviously deciphering through all the governor's executive orders and deciphering all of the relief packages passed at the federal level when it comes to providing these benefits for essential workers, whether it be sick leave. That's something that we continue to monitor, that we continue to work with our constituents to ensure that they have all the information, they have all the resources that they need to take all those precautions, and certainly take the time they need to get healthy should they, become infected.
I think one thing that was really interesting that you just shared is how you grew up and how your brother grew up, and kind of you guys are living the American dream. You're first generation, immigrant family. You've come here, you've succeeded, you've gone to school, and now we've had this big discussion lately of ACA 5, affirmative action, kind of undoing Prop 209. Kind of you and your brother, were able to go to school, I believe, after Prop 209, so you didn't benefit from any of these things. But kind of, can you explain how something like ACA 5 would be beneficial for, I guess, people who were in your situation, kind of looking to go to school and live their dream like you've done?
Sure. And I think that's a great question. And, I did not, I went to school after Prop 209 but I talk about my experience often, about my life experience, about, how I certainly feel extremely fortunate and lucky. I feel like my family in particular, that we, I'm a direct product of this thing called the California dream. My grandfather, who raised my brother and I, he not a day would go by where he would remind us, the importance of hard work, how he would labor in the fields, provide for our family so we didn't have to. How he would always emphasize the importance of creating opportunities for ourselves. No one was going to create them for us, but that was going to be evident through how hard we worked. And so certainly, his advice and encouragement was always an incredibly positive example for myself and for my brother. And so, when I, look back at, growing up in poverty, growing up in farm worker housing, as I mentioned, I didn't know I was poor. I didn't know I was raised by a loving family. And it's because of his sacrifice where I've had these opportunities. But when I look now, as I've mentioned, it was tough back in the 1980s being supported by my grandfather's $6 and 33 cents an hour that here in the late 80s. It was tough back then, but families today face much more difficult circumstances and conditions. And we are in the midst of a historic housing crisis. And in the district I represent, in my backyard in San Bernardino County, in the Salinas Valley, you have families living, they are subletting garages, sheds, rooms. You have 4 or 5 families to a single family home. You have 3 or 4 families sharing a 1-bedroom apartment. And in the rural parts of the Salinas Valley, you have schools where their student homelessness rate is incredible. 1 in 5 students, are classified as homeless. There's an elementary school in the city of Salinas, Sherwood Elementary School, where it was their homeless rate amongst their entire student population was near 40%. It was like 37%. And it's incredibly, unacceptable. And so when you talk about opportunities and how can we expect students that have these, incredible circumstances, unfortunate circumstances outside of the classroom, that they have to go home with, they are homeless, that they live with complete strangers. How is that going to impact their performance in school? And typically, they don't perform very well in school because they have all of these distractions. And I know that because I saw it firsthand. Prior to my time in the state assembly, I was a county supervisor, but I also had 2 other jobs. I worked as an adjunct professor at junior college, and I was what was called a student support manager at one of the largest high schools in California, San Bernardino High School. It was a comprehensive high school. And so I was essentially a dean of discipline. And so I had to work. I was also in charge of truancy. And so I had to work with these at-risk students. And the students that wouldn't have breakfast, students where they came from farm working families and their parents would leave at 4 a.m. and they were just completely absent from their lives. And so these were students that, were not focused. And so it was impossible to expect them to go to the classroom to succeed if they had so many challenges outside the classroom. And so that's why I think this larger issue of mental health and providing adequate services to students within the school setting, but also ensuring that we have a support system for them outside of the school setting is incredibly important. And that's why something like ACA 5 is very important. We should be striving to do everything we can to create opportunities. And some students certainly, there just isn't a level playing field in this state, and a lot of that is exacerbated by the housing crisis that we have. It's unacceptable that we have the highest rate of poverty in this state, which is driven by housing. And so that's why we've got to do a better job here in the legislature of solving this crisis.
You guys just, I guess, passed a version of your budget, sent it to the governor. It's obviously very different than earlier in this year when, there was a surplus in funding. I guess, how has the budget priority changed, I guess, for your district, and kind of how's the budget changing for your district in the sense of, addressing some of these issues you've brought up, and kind of,
Right.
you were just talking, a lot of people are wearing these masks, invest, don't cut.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, what were you able to salvage for your district to ensure, some of these things you're talking about are addressed?
Right. Well, certainly, this pandemic has, upended life in California, and certainly in our country. This is something that has impacted each and every one of us. Every constituent in our district and every resident of California has been impacted by this crisis. And then, obviously, when you talk about a legislative process that is driven by our budget and the priorities around our budget, that clearly has upended the legislative process here in California and here in our state. And certainly, facing this unprecedented budget gap and this deficit, and trying to, as we voted to balance our budget this past Monday, without knowing our revenue figures, for another month, is challenging. This is going to be an evolving situation when it comes to our budget. We have a legislative budget. You have, a governor who has proposed a different budget, and so those negotiations are ongoing. But certainly, our budget situation, this pandemic, is certainly changing the priorities that we started with. We had, we assessed our bill package, all the bills that we had introduced this year, and we, tried to amend them and recalibrate the intent of our bills to address how this crisis was impacting our district, and how we can boost recovery for not only our district but for the entire state. And working with my colleagues, and so the last few months since we reconvened, I've been incredibly busy. I had anticipated to only have maybe 2-3 bills, and I ended up having, I think, 8. And worked with stakeholders, worked with some state agencies, because they believed in the policy, and they believed in the bills we'd introduced. So we did everything we could to reduce cost, and we'll continue to work with stakeholders to, one, reduce costs, but ensure that the policy is targeted toward addressing some aspect of this crisis that we're facing. We had introduced a number of bills around, equalizing access to resources in the rural parts of this state. We had a telehealth bill, which we still have a telehealth bill. We have an e-filing rural access to justice bill. We introduced this Agricultural Workplace and Health and Safety Act, around the conversation we just had, modeled after what the County of Monterey did around workplace guidelines, and there's an educational component to it, and other district priorities that we continue to push and continue to move forward with. But certainly, the success of our legislation is going to be driven by the budget. Once we get those revenue figures in July, understanding the expectations, and trying to live within the expectations of, the fiscal realities we face, is challenging, but certainly is very necessary, because, we have to do everything we can to preserve vital services for our constituents. And I think the biggest issue with, the proposed budget from the governor was trying to balance a budget on education. The impacts to our schools would be significant. Trying to make it proposed massive cuts to our really fragile social safety network here in California, our healthcare system. And so, you have a legislative budget that attempts to backfill a lot of those proposed cuts. But knowing that the situation is an evolving one, we look forward to working with the governor, working with my colleagues in the legislature to do everything we can to preserve those essential services, those essential programs that our constituents rely on. And then also, in relation to the budget, the one request we made, which was a very important one around this issue of housing and critical overcrowded problems, especially within the Latino community, farm working communities, is we had proposed to the administration an expansion of his efforts around Project Roomkey to rapidly rehouse the homeless population. Right. We had requested a $25 million increase to expand that program to include the ability to rapidly rehouse farm workers and their families who live in these critically overcrowded the conditions, because certainly we need to do everything we can to prevent an outbreak. amongst our agricultural workers.
Yeah, I thought this Project Roomkey was kind of an interesting way to deal with the homelessness crisis. I guess, do you see this as a long-term solution to farm worker housing?
Well, I think, it's it's an opportunity. I think Project Roomkey to rapidly rehouse our unsheltered population, if we're able to expand that to farm workers, to provide them temporary housing. Certainly, providing them with temporary housing is critical now, but finding a permanent a solution is what our focus needs to be, and that's why solving this housing crisis. Working with local governments, working with all stakeholders to address this crisis is incredibly, incredibly important. And that's why I support Project Roomkey. I think it's a step in the right direction, but it's a temporary one, and we have to acknowledge that it's not going to solve our problem. But I would hope that the legislature. I really appreciate the legislative effort now within the Assembly, especially within the Senate, in trying to address this housing crisis. But certainly trying to address the crisis for all parts of California is challenging, but it's something that needs to be, a priority for our legislature.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything else you want to get out there before we go?
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to be on. Again, these are certainly unprecedented times, but these are, this is why we signed up for the job. As I mentioned, I never anticipated to ever be an elected official, because of where I came from, the challenges I had around a debilitating speech impediment. But, certainly, I've always had an interest in giving back and serving my community, and having this incredible opportunity to serve a place that has given so much to me and to my family. This has been an experience of a lifetime, and look forward to serving the great district back home, the 30th Assembly District, all of our constituents, and the great state of California. And hopefully in this whole, this pandemic and this public health crisis that we're going through, that we'll come out as a stronger state, and we'll certainly make this a better state for all.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to talking to you again. Thank you, Robert.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Right. Thank you. Take care.
You too. Some are called dreamers.